"I'm selling this obese girl for whiskey!" her father screamed. Then the mountain man bought her. That's how it started. Out in front of the saloon, in plain daylight. No one stopped it. No one asked why he'd step in. But what he saw in her silence, what she carried behind those downcast eyes, would change everything. Out where the snow buries the trails and the law don't follow, she begins to speak, and he begins to listen. But someone's coming, with forged words and bad intentions, and what started as a shameful trade may become a fight for something holy. When a girl's been sold and a man's got nothing left to lose, what will they find in each other the world swore they'd never deserve? Your reactions reaffirm something simple yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Trinidad's dusty main street as Luther Pike guided his laden pack mule toward the weathered hitching post outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. A week's worth of beaver pelts and mountain grime covered his buckskins. His eyes, sharp from scanning mountain ridges for sign, took in the scatter of townsfolk going about their business. The creak of leather and jingle of his mule's harness fell quiet as Luther secured his mount. He'd barely finished the knot when shouting erupted from the saloon's plank porch. A red-faced man in a filthy shirt burst through the swinging doors, yanking something behind him. No, not something, someone. A girl stumbled after him, her wrist caught in his iron grip. She was young, maybe 16, with a sturdy build that spoke of honest work. Despite her size, she seemed to fold in on herself, making herself smaller. A worn Bible was clutched to her chest like a shield. "Who wants her?" the drunk bellowed, shaking the girl's arm. "Trade you this fat lump for a bottle of whiskey." He swayed on his feet, spittle flying. "Ain't good for nothing else." Laughter rippled through the growing crowd, the kind of laughter that comes easy to those who've never known real pain. Luther's jaw tightened as he watched the girl's shoulders hunch further, her eyes fixed on the dusty boards beneath her feet. "Come on now." The man's voice grew louder, desperate. "Somebody buy me a drink. Take her off my hands." He yanked her forward again, and the Bible slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud. The girl didn't reach for it, didn't cry out, just stood there, silent as stone, while cruel laughter swirled around her like wind-blown dust. Luther had seen enough. Without a word, he stepped onto the porch, his spurs ringing against the wooden planks. The crowd parted before him, whispers replacing laughter as he pushed through the saloon's swinging doors. Inside, the barkeep looked up from wiping glasses, squinting at Luther through the smoky air. Luther dropped coins on the bar with a quiet clink. "Whiskey. Full bottle." The barkeep's eyebrows rose, but he set a brown glass bottle on the scarred wood. Luther wrapped his calloused hand around its neck and walked back outside. The drunk was still shouting, but his words died in his throat as Luther approached. Without ceremony, Luther thrust the bottle against the man's chest. Surprised, the drunk released the girl's wrist to grab it. In that moment of silence, Luther bent down and retrieved the fallen Bible, dusting it off with gentle hands. The girl watched him, her eyes wide but still wary, like a young deer unsure whether to bolt. "Come on," Luther said softly, the first words he'd spoken. He held out the Bible to her. She took it carefully, clutching it close again. Luther led her to his mule, aware of the shocked stares boring into his back. With movements practiced from years of loading game, he lifted her onto the mule's broad back, as easily as if she were made of cottonwood fluff. The drunk had already uncorked the bottle, but he lowered it to shout, "Hey now, where you taking her?" Luther ignored him, untying his mule and leading it away from the hitching post. The girl swayed slightly but found her balance, perched among his bundles of furs. Not once did she look back at the man who'd tried to trade her like so much merchandise. They left Trinidad behind, hoofbeats marking time with the setting sun. Luther led them along the trail until the town's lights were just a dim glow on the horizon. When he found a sheltered hollow near a creek, he made camp with practiced efficiency. The girl slid down from the mule without being told, moving to help gather firewood. Her movements were sure and steady now that they were away from town. Still, she didn't speak, and Luther didn't press her. He built a small fire, the flames pushing back the gathering dark. The girl sat on a fallen log, her Bible open in her lap, while Luther tended to his mule and laid out their bedrolls. The only sounds were the pop of burning wood, the burble of the creek, and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Safety wrapped around them like a warm blanket, but the silence remained. Sometimes, Luther knew, silence was the best medicine for a wounded soul. He'd learned that in his own dark days, when words seemed as useless as trying to catch smoke. So they sat, this unlikely pair, while the stars wheeled overhead and the fire burned low. Each lost in their own thoughts, but no longer alone. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Susanna stirred beneath the wool blanket Luther had given her. The morning air held autumn's bite, making the dying embers of their campfire seem especially precious. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as she watched Luther move about the camp with practiced efficiency. He worked in silence, checking his mule before stoking the fire back to life. The familiar scent of coffee soon drifted through their little hollow, carried on wisps of wood smoke. Luther's weathered hands moved with purpose as he poured the dark liquid into 2 battered tin cups. "Here." He offered her 1 cup along with a strip of dried meat. His voice was rough from disuse, like boots on gravel. Susanna accepted both with a small nod, her fingers curling gratefully around the warm metal. The coffee was strong and bitter, but she welcomed its heat. The jerky was tough but flavorful, tasting of smoke and sage. As she ate, her eyes followed Luther's movements while he broke camp. His buckskins bore the marks of hard use, patched in places but clean. His grey-streaked hair and beard were neat despite the trail dust. Everything about him spoke of order and capability. When he began loading the mule, she gathered her courage. Are you taking me to the sheriff?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Luther paused in his work, looking at her directly for the first time that morning. No. Just that single word, but his tone held no threat. Relief flooded through her, making her shoulders sag. She quickly finished her breakfast and folded the blanket, wanting to show she wouldn't be a burden. They set out as the sun cleared the horizon, Luther leading the mule north along the Huerfano River. The water churned and sparkled beside them, its voice a constant companion as they traveled. Cottonwoods lined the banks, their leaves beginning to turn gold with the season. As the morning wore on, the terrain gradually changed. Pine and spruce appeared among the cottonwoods, their green branches reaching toward the cloudless sky. The air grew cooler in their shade, carrying the sharp scent of resin. When they stopped to rest the mule, Susanna didn't wait to be asked. She gathered fallen branches for the evening's fire, stacking them neatly on the mule's pack. At their next stop, she filled their water skins in the river, careful to draw from a clear pool above a small rapid. Luther watched her work without comment, but his eyes held a glimmer of approval. She felt it like sunshine on her face. That evening, they made camp beside a clear creek that joined the river. The sound of running water mixed with the evening songs of birds settling for the night. Luther showed her how to arrange rocks for a fire pit, his movements deliberate so she could learn. As flames began to lick at the dry wood, Susanna found her voice again. "My name is Susanna," she said softly, feeding small sticks to the growing fire. "Susanna Wheatley." Luther nodded, settling onto a fallen log with his coffee. The firelight caught in the creases around his eyes as he studied her across the flames. "I'm 16, she continued, each word coming a little easier. "My mother died when I was small. I don't remember her much." She paused, her hands twisting in her skirt. "My father. He started drinking more this past year. The beatings got worse." Luther's face remained still, but his knuckles whitened around his cup. He said nothing, just listened as the words she'd held inside for so long finally found their way out. After supper, Susanna noticed Luther's skinning knife needed attention. Without asking, she took it and the whetstone he carried, settling close to the fire's warmth. The familiar motion of blade against stone calmed her, and almost without thinking, she began to hum. The hymn rose soft and clear in the gathering darkness. Amazing Grace, the song her mother had sung to her, or so she'd been told. The steady scrape of the whetstone kept time with the melody. Luther had laid out his bedroll but didn't sleep. He stared into the fire, his expression hidden in shadow. Something about the song seemed to trouble him, though Susanna couldn't say why. His stillness was different now. Not peaceful, but weighted with memory. The knife's edge gleamed in the firelight as Susanna tested it carefully with her thumb. Sharp enough to split a hair, just as she'd been taught. She returned it to its sheath and placed it near Luther's blankets before retiring to her own. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the mountain sky. Luther remained awake long after Susanna's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. The hymn seemed to linger in the air, mixing with the creek's endless song and stirring thoughts he'd rather leave buried. The mountains grew steeper as they traveled north. Pine forests closed in around them, dark and thick. By the third day, the October sky had turned the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of snow. Luther kept checking the clouds, his weathered face creased with concern. The first flakes began to fall just past noon. They drifted down like feathers at first, melting when they touched the ground. Within an hour, the snow fell faster, collecting on pine boughs and coating the trail with white. The temperature dropped quickly, and Susanna pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Luther noticed her shivering. Without a word, he removed his buckskin coat and passed it back to her. When she tried to refuse, he simply dropped it in her lap. The coat smelled of wood smoke and pine sap, and its weight was immediately comforting. "Not far now," Luther said, his voice barely carrying over the soft hush of falling snow. He led them up a narrow draw between two rocky ridges. The mule picked its way carefully along the trail, which wound past a frozen creek and up toward a natural cleft in the stone. There, tucked against the rock face, stood Luther's cabin. It was small but solid, built of thick pine logs with a stone chimney. A lean-to shelter extended from one side, providing storage for firewood and tools. Despite its modest size, the sight of shelter made Susanna's heart leap with relief. Luther worked quickly to settle the mule in the lean-to, covering it with a heavy blanket. He showed Susanna how to work the door latch, then carried their supplies inside. The cabin's single room was cold and dark, but clean. A narrow bed stood against one wall, while a small table and two chairs occupied the center. A cast-iron stove squatted in the corner, its pipe rising up through the roof. "Take the bed," Luther said, already kneeling to build a fire in the stove. "I'll sleep on the floor." Susanna wanted to protest, but something in his tone told her it would do no good. Instead, she set about making the space more livable. She found a broom in the corner and swept the plank floor while Luther brought in more firewood. As warmth began to fill the cabin, she discovered a few basic provisions in a wooden box: dried beans, coffee, salt pork, and cornmeal. The familiar work of cooking settled her nerves. She soaked the beans and set them to simmer with a piece of salt pork, just as she'd done hundreds of times before. The homey smell soon filled the small space, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and fresh snow. While the beans cooked, Susanna carefully removed her Bible from where she'd kept it safe inside her dress. The book was worn, its leather cover soft from years of handling. She placed it on the table with gentle reverence, smoothing its pages with work-roughened fingers. Luther watched her from his place by the stove, his expression unreadable in the growing darkness. Outside, the snow fell harder, scratching against the single window like tiny claws. After they'd eaten their supper of beans and cornbread, Susanna gathered her courage. "Do you believe in God, Mr. Pike?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luther was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke, his words heavy with something that sounded like loss. "Used to." Susanna nodded, running her fingers along the Bible's spine. "I still pray," she said. "Every night. Used to pray he'd make me different, make me smaller." She paused, swallowing hard. "Now I just pray that someday someone might look at me with kindness. Just once." The fire crackled in the stove, throwing shadows on the log walls. Luther's face remained in darkness, but his shoulders seemed to carry a new weight. When it was time to sleep, Luther made his bed on the floor with his bedroll, refusing the extra blanket Susanna offered. The cabin grew quiet except for the pop of burning wood and the endless whisper of snow. In the deepest part of the night, Luther dreamed. In his dream, Sarah stood at their old cabin door, golden hair catching the sunset light. She smiled at him, the same smile that had won his heart 20 years before. Their little girl, Mary, played in the yard, her laughter bright as spring water. The scene was so real he could smell Sarah's bread baking, could hear the creak of the porch boards under his feet. But then the dream changed, as it always did. Sarah's face grew pale, then grey. Mary's laughter turned to coughing. The sunset became winter twilight, and he was alone again, watching 2 rough wooden crosses slowly disappear under drifting snow. Luther woke with a start, his cheeks wet with tears that had frozen in his beard. The cabin was dark and cold, the fire had burned low. From the bed came the sound of soft, steady breathing. Susanna slept peacefully, her Bible clutched to her chest. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the snow fall and remembering the weight of Sarah's hand in his, the sound of Mary's prayers before bed. For the first time in years, the memories brought something besides pain, a faint warmth, like sunrise touching distant mountains. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered window, casting pale shadows across the cabin floor. Luther stirred the embers in the stove, adding fresh kindling to bring the fire back to life. Outside, the snow had piled knee-deep during the night, transforming the landscape into a white wilderness. Susanna watched him work with the wood, her hands folded in her lap. "I can help with that," she offered quietly. "Pa made me split wood since I was 10. Luther glanced at her, doubt flickering across his weathered features. But something in her steady gaze made him nod. He led her to the woodpile under the lean-to, showed her where he kept the smaller axe. "Kindling needs to be thin," he explained, demonstrating the proper technique. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." Susanna's first few attempts were clumsy. The axe glanced off the wood more than once, but she didn't give up. Her strokes were slow but powerful, and soon she developed a rhythm. Luther watched as she worked, noting how she adjusted her stance without complaint, how she persisted despite her obvious fatigue. The snow continued to fall throughout the week, building deep drifts around the cabin. They fell into a natural pattern of shared work. Each morning, Luther checked his trap line, bringing home rabbits and the occasional fox. Susanna learned to skin the animals with careful precision, her large hands proving surprisingly gentle with the delicate work. "My ma taught me to sew before she passed," she explained one afternoon, her fingers working steadily with Luther's skinning knife. "Ain't so different from stitching cloth when you think about it." Luther found himself watching her more and more. She hummed hymns while she worked, her voice sweet and clear in the quiet cabin. She kept their living space tidy, managed their food stores with careful wisdom, and never complained about the endless chores. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they began to talk. At first, it was just practical matters, what needed mending, how much firewood remained, when the snow might let up. But gradually, Susanna began to share more of herself. "Used to dream of being a teacher," she confided one night, stirring the rabbit stew she'd made. "Loved reading more than anything. Learned my letters from Ma's Bible before she died." Luther looked up from where he was repairing a snowshoe. "What stopped you?" Susanna's shoulders hunched slightly. "People said I wasn't fit for it. Too big. too slow-minded. She stirred the pot with more force than necessary. Pa said nobody'd want their children learning from someone like me. Said I was too much of everything wrong. Luther's hands stilled on his work. He'd noticed how quick she was to understand things, how she could recite whole passages of scripture from memory, how she figured sums in her head while measuring cooking ingredients. The thought of someone crushing such a bright spirit made his chest tight with anger. They were wrong, he said simply, his gruff voice firm with conviction. Susanna's eyes glistened in the lamplight, but she didn't cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and served their supper with quiet dignity. As the days passed, Luther found himself taking an unexpected pride in her accomplishments. She learned to set snares under his guidance, her face glowing with triumph when she caught her first rabbit. She mastered the art of starting a fire with damp wood, never giving up until the flames caught. Each small victory felt like a personal triumph to Luther, though he couldn't explain why. One evening, while Susanna was washing their tin plates, Luther pulled something from his pocket. A small wooden whistle he'd been carving in secret. It was simple, made from a piece of pine, but he'd smoothed it carefully and added a leather cord so it could be worn around the neck. "Here," he said gruffly, holding it out to her. "Made this for you. Thought it might be useful, in case you need to signal when you're out gathering wood." Susanna took the whistle with trembling hands. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, touched the simple designs he'd carved along its length. Then, to Luther's alarm, she began to cry. Not the harsh sobs he'd expected, but silent tears that rolled down her cheeks like spring rain. "Nobody's ever made me something before," she whispered, clutching the whistle to her chest. "Nobody except Ma, and she's been gone so long." Luther shifted uncomfortably, but something warm bloomed in his chest as he watched her slip the cord around her neck. The whistle looked right there, like it belonged, like she belonged. That night, as the fire burned low and snow whispered against the cabin walls, Luther listened to Susanna practicing with the whistle. The notes were tentative at first, then grew more confident. The simple tune she played reminded him of the lullabies Sarah used to sing to Mary, and for the first time in years, the memory brought more comfort than pain. The morning sun glinted off the snow-laden branches, casting diamond-bright sparkles across the pristine drifts. Susanna stood at the cabin window, a tin cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched Luther check his trapline. The past 2 weeks had settled into a peaceful rhythm, the cabin becoming a sanctuary from the harsh world beyond. A movement in the trees caught her eye. A figure on snowshoes emerged from the forest, breaking trail through the deep snow. She recognized the distinctive red beard even at a distance. Hobby Marsh, the trapper who carried mail between the mountain camps. "Luther!" she called out. "Someone's coming!" Luther straightened from his work, hand moving instinctively to his rifle before recognizing the visitor. He trudged through the snow to meet Hobie, who was breathing heavily from the climb. "Mighty cold trek," Hobie wheezed, shouldering off his heavy pack. "But figured you'd be needin' supplies by now." They helped him into the cabin, where Susanna already had fresh coffee waiting. Hobie's eyes widened slightly when he saw her, recognition flickering across his weathered face. He accepted the cup with a nod but remained standing, shifting uncomfortably. "Luther," he said in a lowered voice, though Susanna could still hear clearly in the small cabin. "Need to have a word with you. Private-like." Luther glanced at Susanna, who busied herself with the stove. "Anything you need to say, you can say in front of her." Hobie sighed, setting down his cup. "Reckon that's fair, seeing as it concerns her directly." He pulled off his snow-crusted coat. "There's trouble brewing down in Trinidad. Girl's father's been raising all manner of hell." Susanna's hands stilled on the stovetop. Luther's jaw tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "He's filed kidnapping charges with the marshal," Hobie said grimly. "Claims you took her against her will. Worse yet, he's got papers, guardianship documents giving him legal right to her until she's 21. "Forged," Luther growled. "She's 16, old enough to choose." "Maybe so," Hobie agreed. But the law might see it different, and there's more. He glanced apologetically at Susanna. There's talk of a bounty forming. Legal or not, money has a way of drawing certain types of men. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Susanna's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Those papers, they're lies. Everything Pa writes is lies. Luther paced the small space, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Any way to fight this proper? Through the courts? Hobie nodded slowly. I know a lawyer down in Pueblo, fellow named Harrison. Helped you with that mining claim dispute few years back. I can get a letter to him, maybe see what can be done legal-wise. Luther immediately moved to his small desk, pulling out paper and a stubby pencil. His large hands, more accustomed to trapping and hunting, carefully formed each letter as he wrote out the situation. Susanna watched him, her hands twisting in her apron. When he finished, Luther sealed the letter and handed it to Hobie along with a few coins. Fast as you can, he said quietly. Hobie tucked the letter into his coat. I'll head out now. Try to make Pueblo by week's end. He shouldered his lightened pack, then paused at the door. Watch your back, Luther. Snow won't keep men away forever if the price is right. After Hobie left, the cabin seemed eerily quiet. Luther stood at the window, watching until the trapper disappeared into the trees. When he turned back, Susanna was sitting at the table, her Bible open before her, but her eyes were distant. If they take me back, she said softly, her fingers tracing the worn pages, I'll never be free again. She looked up at Luther, her eyes clear and determined. Pa will make sure of it. He'll marry me off to whoever offers the most whiskey, or worse. Luther's hands clenched at his sides. He'd seen enough of frontier justice to know how this could go. Even if they proved her father's documents false, the law might still side with him. A father's rights over a daughter were nearly absolute in these territories. We'll figure something, he said gruffly, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Harrison's a good lawyer, knows how to work within the law. Susanna nodded, but her shoulders remained tense. She stood and moved to the stove, falling back into their routine of preparing the evening meal. But now there was a shadow over their sanctuary, a threat lurking beyond the snow-covered mountains. Luther watched her work, seeing how she held herself straight despite her fear. In just 2 weeks, she'd grown stronger, more sure of herself. The thought of her being forced back into her father's cruel hands made something fierce and protective rise in his chest. As if reading his thoughts, Susanna turned to him. Whatever comes, she said quietly, these weeks have been worth it. You showed me what it means to be treated like a person, not a burden. Her voice grew stronger. And now I know what freedom tastes like. That's something they can't take away. The heavy snowfall continued through the night, blanketing the mountain cabin in pristine white. Luther sat at his rough-hewn table, a map spread before him, his finger tracing possible routes northward. Wyoming territory stretched vast and wild above them, a place where a man and his daughter could vanish into the wilderness. We could make it, he said, breaking the evening silence. I know these mountains better than any marshal. Got friends up near Laramie who'd help us settle. Susanna looked up from where she sat mending one of his shirts by the firelight. Her eyes were steady, showing none of the fear from earlier. No, she said simply. I won't spend my life running. Luther's weathered face creased with concern. Might be safer than facing your pa in court. Safety isn't everything, Susanna replied, setting aside her sewing. I want to live honest, not looking over my shoulder. She stood and moved to the table, her large frame moving with quiet grace. If we run, we're saying pa's lies are stronger than the truth. Luther studied her face in the lamplight, seeing not the frightened girl he'd rescued, but a woman with deep conviction. Her gentle eyes held steel beneath their warmth. Reckon you might be right, he admitted, but the law ain't always fair out here. Then we make it fair. Susanna said. With words and truth, not running. Over the next few days, they worked together drafting a formal affidavit. Luther spoke while Susanna wrote, her penmanship flowing across the paper in perfect script. She'd learned her letters well despite her father's neglect, and Luther found himself impressed by how she could capture his rough thoughts in elegant phrases. Need to explain about that day in Trinidad, Luther muttered, pacing near the fireplace. Make it clear what your pa was doing. Susanna's quill scratched steadily. I remember every word he said, she replied quietly. Every person who stood watching, every detail matters for the truth. They worked through each point carefully. The abuse she'd suffered, her age and right to choose her path, Luther's intervention to prevent her being sold. When finished, the affidavit stood as stark testimony to both human cruelty and compassion. Hobby returned 4 days later, his red beard crusted with ice. They gave him the affidavit along with Luther's last coins for delivery to the lawyer in Pueblo. As they watched him disappear into the swirling snow, Susanna touched the carved whistle that still hung around her neck. Now we wait, she said softly, and trust. The days grew longer as they settled in for winter's grip. Each evening, Susanna began reading aloud from her worn Bible. Luther would sit in his chair by the fire, whittling or mending traps, not participating but listening. Though he'd lost his faith years ago with his wife and daughter, something in Susanna's clear voice touched him, not the words themselves, but the quiet strength behind them. One particularly cold morning, Luther returned from checking his trapline with a rabbit, its leg badly mangled in the trap's teeth. Usually he'd discard such poor meat, but game had been scarce lately. He handed it to Susanna apologetically. She took the rabbit without complaint, her capable hands already working. This will make a fine stew, she said, reaching for herbs she'd dried and hung from the rafters. Just needs time and care to become something good. Luther watched as she transformed the meager ingredient into a hearty meal, stretching it with dried vegetables and dumplings made from their dwindling flour. The cabin filled with savory steam as the stew simmered, making his mouth water despite himself. That evening, as they sat eating together, Luther realized how much had changed. The silent girl he'd rescued had bloomed into someone who filled the cabin with purpose and life. She'd brought warmth to more than just their meals. Outside, snow continued falling in thick curtains, but inside their small shelter, a different kind of warmth grew. Not just the heat from the cooking fire or the sealed walls, but the warmth of two souls finding unexpected family in each other's company. Thank you, Susanna said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. Not just for saving me that day, but for listening now. For letting me choose how to face this. Luther nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, but moved by her words. You've got a strong spirit, he said gruffly. Stronger than running. Reckon I needed reminding that sometimes standing firm is braver than riding away. Susanna smiled, the expression transforming her plain features into something beautiful. She returned to her Bible reading, voice steady and clear in the fire-lit cabin, while Luther listened and thought about courage wearing unexpected faces. The morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight glinting off the fresh snow like scattered diamonds. Luther stood on the cabin's small porch, his old Henry rifle in hand, watching as Susanna carefully packed down a row of tin cans on a fallen log 50 paces out. Ain't never shot before, she admitted, returning to his side. Her breath made little clouds in the cold air. Luther nodded, holding out the rifle. Time you learned. World ain't always kind to lone women. He showed her how to hold it, his weathered hands adjusting her grip on the smooth wood stock. Stock goes firm against your shoulder like this, helps with the kick. Susanna's large frame tensed as she took the weapon's weight. What if I miss? Then you miss, Luther said simply. Ain't no shame in learning. He stepped back, watching as she squared her shoulders. Take your time. Breathe slow. When you're ready, squeeze gentle. Don't pull. The rifle crack echoed across the snow-covered clearing. The first shot went wide, making Susanna flinch. But Luther noticed how she immediately steadied herself, adjusting her stance without prompting. "Again," he said softly. Her second shot clipped the edge of a can, sending it spinning. A small smile touched her lips. By the sixth shot, she was hitting more than missing, her movements becoming more confident with each reload. "You got a good eye," Luther said, pride warming his voice. "Steady hands, too." Susanna lowered the rifle, her cheeks flushed from more than just the cold. "Never thought I could do something like this," she said quietly. "Pa always said I was too clumsy for anything but cooking." "Your pa was wrong about a lot of things," Luther replied, taking the rifle to clean it. The morning sun had risen higher, bringing unusual warmth to the winter air. Later that day, Luther strapped on his snowshoes and helped Susanna with hers. "Want to show you something?" he said, leading her up a narrow trail through the deep snow. The going was slow. Susanna was still learning to manage the awkward shoes, but she persevered without complaint. When they reached the ridge top, Luther stopped. Below them stretched the valley, where patches of dark earth had begun showing through the melting snow. A creek ran through the center, its ice breaking up to reveal flashes of running water. In the distance, early spring clouds gathered over the peaks. "Winter's losing its grip," Luther observed, leaning on his walking stick. "Another few weeks, the passes'll start clearing." Susanna stood beside him, taking in the view. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "like God's own painting." She glanced at him. "Will we have to leave when spring comes?" Luther heard the worry in her voice. "This cabin's as much yours as mine now," he said gruffly. "Ain't going nowhere unless you want to." They watched the valley in comfortable silence until the sun began to dip. The return trip was easier, following their own tracks down. By the time they reached the cabin, evening was settling in, bringing back winter's chill. Inside, Susanna built up the fire while Luther hung their wet snowshoes to dry. The familiar routine felt peaceful, domestic in a way that still surprised him. As she worked, Susanna hummed softly, a lullaby he hadn't heard in years. The melody caught in his chest like a physical thing. "My Sarah used to sing that," he said suddenly, the words coming unbidden. "To our Jenny." Susanna's hands stilled on the kindling. She didn't speak, just waited with gentle patience. Luther sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the growing flames. "Jenny was 10 when the influenza came through our settlement," he continued slowly. "Sarah caught it first, then Jenny. I tried everything, willowbark tea, cold compresses, prayer." His voice roughened. Nothing helped. Jenny went quick at least. Sarah lingered 3 more days. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Susanna moved quietly to her Bible, running her fingers over its worn cover. "Would you like to hear the whole song?" she asked softly. "The one Jenny might have known?" Luther couldn't speak, just nodded. Susanna's clear voice filled the cabin with the old lullaby, sweet and pure as spring water. The familiar words washed over him like a blessing, breaking something loose in his heart. He felt the tears then, running into his beard, the first he'd shed since burying his family. He didn't try to hide them. Susanna kept singing, her voice tender but strong, like a light leading him home through dark waters. When the song ended, she placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Luther covered it with his own, rough palm engulfing her smooth one. They stayed that way as the fire burned low, 2 souls brought together by loss and mercy, finding healing in each other's presence. Outside, an early spring wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of change. But inside the cabin, father and daughter had already found their new season. The telegram arrived with Hubby Marsh on a blustery afternoon, 2 weeks after their day on the ridge. Luther watched through the cabin's frosted window as the mail runner trudged through knee-deep snow, his red beard crusted with ice. "Got news," Hobie announced, stamping his boots as he entered. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to Luther. "Judge Harrington's willing to hear your case. Says he needs formal testimony, though, yours and mine both, to override them forged papers." Luther read the telegram twice, his weathered face growing serious. Susanna stood by the fire, her hands clasped tight around her Bible. "What does it say?" she asked quietly. "Judge needs us in Trinidad," Luther replied, looking up at her. "Says he's sympathetic but needs to hear the truth spoken in his court proper." Hobie warmed his hands by the stove. "Harrington's a fair man. Lost his own daughter to false accusations some years back. Reckon that's why he's taking special interest in this case." Luther nodded slowly. "How are the passes looking?" "Starting to clear some. Another week they'll be passable if you're careful. Take you 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the weather." Hobie accepted a cup of coffee from Susanna. "Town's still stirred up, though. Your pa's been making noise, girl." Susanna's hands trembled slightly as she poured her own cup, but her voice stayed steady. "He can make all the noise he wants. I ain't going back to him." Luther watched her with pride. The scared girl from the saloon porch was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth. After Hobie left, they began preparing for the journey. Luther checked his gear while Susanna packed provisions, dried meat, beans, coffee, hardtack. They worked in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of family. That evening, as Luther oiled his saddle by lamplight, Susanna approached with something wrapped in a scrap of cloth. "Made these," she said softly, holding out the bundle. "For the trip." Luther unwrapped it to find a pair of mittens, carefully stitched from scraps of wool blanket. The needlework was fine and even, each stitch placed with care. "Been working on them at night," she explained, watching his face. "Your old ones were wearing thin." Luther ran his thumb over the neat seams, something catching in his throat. Such a simple gift, but it spoke volumes about the changes in both their lives. "You're the only man who ever looked at me without shame," Susanna said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The only one who saw me as something more than just—" She trailed off, blinking back tears. Luther set the mittens down and stood, his large frame casting a shadow in the lamplight. "Listen here, girl," he said gruffly, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You're mine. You always will be. Don't matter what no judge says, what no paper claims. You're my daughter now, same as if you'd been born to me." Susanna's eyes filled, but she smiled through the tears. Luther pulled her into a rough embrace, his heart full of a fierce, protective love he'd thought died with Jenny. They spent the next few days watching the weather, waiting for their chance. Luther checked and rechecked their supplies, while Susanna sewed extra patches on their warmest clothes. At night they studied the Bible together, not for the scripture, but for the comfort of routine and closeness. Finally, a clear dawn arrived, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold. They loaded Luther's mule with their gear and provisions, everything secured against the rough journey ahead. Susanna took one last look at the cabin before mounting her horse, a gentle mare Luther had borrowed from Hobie. The small shelter had become more than just a refuge. It had become the place where she'd found her true self, her true family. "Ready?" Luther asked, adjusting his new mittens. Susanna nodded, straightening her shoulders. "Ready." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, their horses breaking trail through the crusty snow. The path ahead would be hard, but they faced it together, father and daughter by choice, bound by something stronger than blood or law. Behind them, smoke rose straight and true from the cabin's chimney, a beacon they would return to when justice was done. The morning wind carried the promise of spring, and with it, the hope of new beginnings. The morning's promise faded quickly as they descended from the high country. What had been crisp snow turned to treacherous slush, and by midday, their horses struggled through mud that reached past their fetlocks. The mule, laden with their supplies, picked its way carefully along the narrowing trail. Luther kept one eye on the sky and another on Susanna. She rode straight-backed despite the difficult conditions, though her cheeks were red from the biting wind. The gentle mare Hobie had lent them proved steady, but the going was slow. "Reckon we won't make Trinidad by nightfall tomorrow," Luther said during a brief rest. He handed Susanna a piece of jerky and watched as she shared a bit with her horse. "This thaw's making the trail worse than I figured." Susanna nodded, brushing wet snow from her shawl. "How far have we come?" "Maybe 10 miles, if that." Luther squinted at the sun, now hidden behind thick clouds. "River's just ahead. We'll make camp there for the night." They pressed on through the afternoon. The sound of their horses' hooves sucking at the mud and the creak of leather filled the quiet air. Occasionally, a patch of blue sky would peek through, but the warmth only made the trail more treacherous. When they finally reached the river, its banks were swollen with melting snow. Luther found them a sheltered spot beneath a stand of cottonwoods where the ground rose slightly above the muddy flats. He helped Susanna dismount, noting how her hands trembled slightly from the cold. "Let's get a fire going," he said, leading the horses to higher ground. "You rest while I set up camp." But Susanna wouldn't hear of it. She gathered dry kindling from beneath the cottonwoods while Luther unsaddled the horses. Together they raised the small tent and soon had a cheerful fire crackling, pushing back the gathering darkness. Over a simple supper of beans and coffee, Susanna grew quiet, stirring her tin cup without drinking. Luther recognized the look on her face, the same one she'd worn when Hobie first brought news of her father's claims. "What if—" she began, then stopped, biting her lip. Luther set down his cup. "Speak your mind, girl. What if the judge believes Pa?" The words tumbled out in a rush. "What if those papers look real enough, and he don't listen to what really happened? What if—" "Truth leaves footprints," Luther interrupted gently. "Same as we're leaving in this mud. Ain't no forged paper can match the real story written in a person's heart." Susanna looked up at him, firelight reflecting in her eyes. "You really believe that?" "I do." Luther's voice grew firm. "Your Pa's tracks are crooked, full of lies and whiskey and meanness, but yours are steady. True. Any judge worth his salt will see that plain as day." A log popped in the fire, sending sparks swirling up into the darkening sky. Susanna pulled her Bible from her satchel, its worn leather cover smooth from years of handling. She held it close, like a shield against her fears. Would you mind if I pray out loud?" she asked hesitantly. "Ma always said prayers spoken true carry further than those just thought." Luther nodded, something stirring in his chest at her simple faith. "Go ahead." Susanna closed her eyes, her voice soft but clear in the night air. "Dear Lord, I ain't asking for easy paths. You can see how muddy this one is." A small smile touched her lips. "But I'm asking for courage, for both of us. Help us stand straight and speak true when we face that judge. And—" she paused. "Thank you for sending Luther to that saloon porch. Amen." The simple prayer hung in the air like the smoke from their fire, straight and true. Luther watched Susanna wrap herself in her blanket, her Bible still clutched close. The sight of her there, strong despite her fears, brought back memories of evening prayers with Jenny and their daughter Sarah before the fever took them. Without quite knowing why, Luther found himself moving to kneel beside Susanna. His knees creaked as he settled onto the damp ground, and his hands felt clumsy as he clasped them together. It had been years, so many years, since he'd done this. "Lord," he began roughly, then cleared his throat. "Lord, I ain't been much for talking to you since my family went to glory. Figured you had your reasons, but I couldn't see them. Still ain't sure I do." He paused, feeling Susanna's surprised gaze on him. "But you sent this girl to me, put her in my path when she needed someone, and maybe when I needed someone too. So I'm asking, help me be worthy of that trust. Help me protect her, same as if she was my own Sarah." His voice cracked on his daughter's name, but he pressed on. "And Lord, thank you for showing me there's still good in this world. Still love. Amen." When he opened his eyes, he found Susanna watching him, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Without a word, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tight. They sat like that for a long while, watching the fire burn low, their joined hands a bridge across years of loss and loneliness. The river murmured nearby, its voice steady and constant in the gathering night. Above them, stars began to peek through breaking clouds, as if heaven itself had paused to listen to their prayers. The second day dawned warmer, turning more snow to slush. Luther and Susanna made steady progress along the muddy trail, the horses picking their way carefully through patches of melting ice. By midday, the familiar peaks around Trinidad appeared on the horizon, dark shapes against the clouded sky. Luther felt uneasy. Something about the quiet didn't sit right with him. Even the birds seemed hushed. He kept one hand near his rifle, scanning the scattered pine stands they passed. "We're making better time today," Susanna said, adjusting her shawl against the damp wind. Her mare's hooves made soft, sucking sounds in the mud. Luther nodded, about to reply, when movement caught his eye. A flash of metal through the trees. Before he could shout a warning, 3 riders burst from the cover of a dense pine thicket. "Hold right there." The lead rider wore a deputy's badge, but Luther didn't recognize him. The other 2 men flanked them, rifles raised. "Marshal deputized us special," the badge wearer announced, his horse dancing nervously. "We're here for the girl." Luther shifted his mount between Susanna and the men. "We're headed to see the judge. Got papers to prove Shut your mouth, kidnapper," one of the other men spat. "We know what you did, taking her from her pa like that." "No!" Susanna's voice rang out clear and strong. "He saved me!" "My father was trying to sell—" The deputy cut her off. "That ain't how your pa tells it, girl. Says this mountain man bewitched you somehow." He jerked his chin at his companions. "Get her." Luther's rifle came up, but he was too slow. The 3rd rider had circled behind during the talk. Something hard crashed against Luther's skull. The world tilted sideways as he tumbled from his saddle. Through blurring vision, he saw Susanna fighting, kicking as they dragged her from her horse. "Luther!" she screamed. "Luther, please!" He tried to rise, but another blow sent him sprawling. Bootsteps approached. A kick rolled him onto his back. "Should we finish him?" someone asked. "Nah, the cold'll do it for us. Or the wolves. Mount up!" Luther could only watch helplessly as they forced Susanna onto one of their horses. Her screams grew fainter as they rode away, leaving him broken in the mud. Darkness took him. The sound of hooves brought him back to dim consciousness. Small hands touched his face. Through swollen eyes, he made out a young boy's concerned face. The child wore buckskin, his long black hair in 2 braids. The boy spoke rapid Ute, then switched to broken English. "You hurt bad. I get help." Luther tried to speak, but only managed a groan. The boy vanished. Time blurred. More hooves approached, many this time. Gentle hands lifted him. Someone spoke Ute words of comfort as they placed him across a travois. The journey passed in waves of pain and confusion. Luther caught glimpses of familiar mountains, heard the creak of lodge poles being raised. The scent of pine smoke brought him fully awake. He lay in a warm teepee, wrapped in soft buffalo robes. An elderly woman knelt beside him, brewing something that smelled of pine needles and sage. Behind her stood a man Luther recognized, Grey Wolf, a hunter he'd helped years ago when drought had driven game from their usual hunting grounds. "Brother," Grey Wolf said in careful English, "the boy found you in time. The spirits guided him." Luther's throat felt like sand. "The girl," he croaked. "They took her. Drink first." The old woman held a cup of pine tea to his lips. "Then we tell stories." As Luther sipped the bitter tea, Grey Wolf settled cross-legged beside him. "My son found you where bad men left you. But you found us once when hunger walked in our lodge. Now we find you. The circle turns." The tea warmed Luther's belly, easing some of the pain in his head. The old woman, Grey Wolf's mother, he now remembered, began to sing softly as she tended his wounds. Her weathered hands were gentle as she applied poultices of herbs. "Rest now," she said in Ute. "The stories will wait until your spirit returns to your body." But Luther couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Susanna being dragged away, heard her screams. His failure to protect her burned worse than any wound. Grey Wolf seemed to read his thoughts. "The girl they took, she is your daughter now?" "Yes," Luther whispered. "In my heart, she is." The old woman nodded approvingly, still singing her medicine song. Grey Wolf touched Luther's shoulder. "Then we will help you find her. But first, you must let the stories heal you." Through the afternoon and evening, as Luther drifted between sleep and waking, they shared tales of courage and perseverance, stories of warriors who seemed defeated but rose again, of children lost and found, of justice that came like spring after winter. The pine tea and poultices did their work, but Luther knew it was the stories that truly began to heal him. Each one reminded him that he wasn't alone, that good people still existed in this hard world. That hope, like the small fire in the center of the teepee, could warm the darkest night. The women's reform home loomed like a grey fortress on Trinidad's eastern edge. Inside a second-floor room, Susanna sat on a narrow bed, her Bible clutched close. 3 days had passed since the deputies had dragged her here. 3 days of being told she was confused, deluded, in need of correction. Sunlight filtered through the barred window, casting shadows across the bare wooden floor. The room held only a bed, a washstand, and a straight-backed chair. They'd taken her shawl, her carved whistle from Luther, everything except her Bible. Heavy footsteps approached. The door creaked open, and Matron Fowler entered, her face pinched with disapproval. She carried a tray with a bowl of thin soup and a heel of bread. "Still sulking, I see," the matron said, setting down the tray. "Your father is very concerned about your state of mind." Susanna straightened her spine. "My father tried to sell me for whiskey. Luther Pike saved—" "Enough!" Matron Fowler's voice cracked like a whip. "That mountain man filled your head with lies. Look at yourself, girl." She gestured at Susanna's large frame with contempt. "Who would want you except to take advantage? You're too big, too plain to ever be truly wanted. Best accept that now." The words struck like physical blows, but Susanna refused to cry. She'd heard worse from her father. Instead, she opened her Bible to Psalm 23, running her finger along the familiar words. "Praying won't change what you are," the matron said. "Eat your soup before it gets cold." She left, the lock clicking firmly into place. Susanna ignored the food. She moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, Luther lay wounded, or worse. The memory of him falling from his horse haunted her dreams. "Lord," she whispered, "please let him live. And give me strength to endure this place." Each night she knelt by her bed and prayed the same prayer. During the day she endured the matron's cruel words, the whispered gossip of the other girls, the crushing weight of being disbelieved. But in the quiet darkness, she found comfort in remembered kindnesses, Luther teaching her to shoot, his gruff pride when she skinned her first rabbit, the way he'd called her mine. Miles away, in a Ute camp nestled against the foothills, Luther was slowly healing. The old woman, who insisted he call her grandmother, tended his wounds with gentle determination. She brewed medicines from pine needles and herbs, singing healing songs as she worked. Grey Wolf's people shared their food without hesitation. They brought him rabbit stew, dried berries, and fresh-caught trout. Each offering came with a story or a memory of the winter he'd helped them, when drought had driven the elk herds away and their children had gone hungry. "You brought us meat," Grey Wolf reminded him, "when others would have left us to starve. You didn't ask for payment then." Luther remembered that hard winter. He'd spent weeks tracking and hunting, sharing everything he caught. Any man would have done the same, he said. Grey Wolf shook his head. Many men would have passed by. You stopped. You saw our need. Now we see yours. On the fourth morning, Grandmother declared Luther strong enough to sit up. She brought him a special tea made from bitter roots and honey. Your body mends, she said in careful English. But your heart bleeds for the girl child. Luther nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The old woman patted his hand. When my youngest son was taken to the white man's school, I thought my heart would stop beating. But Creator gave me strength to fight, to wait, to act when the time was right. She pressed a small medicine pouch into his palm. We will help you get her back. That evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold, the tribal elder visited Luther's lodge. The old man's face was deeply lined, his eyes bright with wisdom. He sat cross-legged beside Luther's pallet and lit a small pipe. You gave us meat when we starved, the elder said after sharing the pipe. Now we lend strength to your bones. He touched Luther's chest, and to your spirit, which carries a father's pain. Luther bowed his head, moved beyond words. These people who had so little were giving him so much: food, medicine, shelter, and now their promise of help. Tomorrow, the elder continued, you will stand. The next day you will walk. And when you are ready, our young men will ride with you. The girl child must be found before her spirit breaks. That night, Luther lay awake, listening to the wind in the pines. His body ached less, and determination replaced his despair. Somewhere in Trinidad, Susanna was holding on to hope. He wouldn't let her faith in him be broken. He touched the medicine pouch Grandmother had given him, feeling its power. Like Susanna's prayers in her locked room, it was a reminder that he wasn't alone. That justice, like healing, sometimes needed helping hands to flourish. The morning sun cast long shadows across Trinidad's muddy streets as Luther Pike rode slowly into town. 2 Ute warriors flanked him on painted ponies, their presence drawing wary stares from townspeople hurrying to their morning business. Luther's side still ached, but determination kept him straight in the saddle. The courthouse bell tolled 9 times as they dismounted. Luther's boots hit the ground with a grimace, his ribs protesting. The younger Ute warrior, Swifthawk, steadied him with a strong hand. We wait here, Swifthawk said quietly. If trouble comes, you will hear our call. Luther nodded his thanks and climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, the hearing had already begun. He could hear Judge Harrington's measured voice through the heavy oak door. Pushing it open, Luther entered just as the judge was speaking. Given the documents presented, I have no choice but to remand Miss Wheatley to her father's custody. Your Honor! Luther's voice boomed across the courtroom. Heads turned, gasps rippled through the crowd. Susanna, standing pale but straight-backed before the judge's bench, let out a cry of joy. Judge Harrington's gavel cracked once. Who interrupts this court? Luther Pike, Your Honor, and I bring witnesses. Hobie Marsh stood from his seat near the front, holding up a leather portfolio. Got them affidavits right here, Judge, plus testimony from Widow Carson about the whiskey incident. The judge adjusted his spectacles, studying the new documents. Minutes ticked by as he read, the courtroom silent except for the scratch of turning pages. Finally, he looked up, his eyes sharp. Mr. Wheatley, these sworn statements paint a very different picture than your claims, including evidence that you forged guardianship papers. Susanna's father, red-faced and swaying slightly, started to protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Miss Wheatley, Judge Harrington said gently, please, approach the bench. Susanna walked forward, her steps steady despite her trembling hands. Tell me, child, in your own words, what you want. She stood tall, her voice clear and strong. I want to be free, Your Honor, free to choose my own path, and I choose to live with Luther Pike, who showed me kindness when no one else would. The judge nodded slowly, removing his spectacles. The law exists to protect, not to imprison. These guardianship papers are hereby nullified." He turned to Susanna's father. "You, sir, will face charges for forgery, and you, Miss Wheatley, are declared legally emancipated, free to live where you choose." The gavel struck once more, final and firm. Susanna turned to Luther, tears streaming down her face, and wrapped her arms around him. He held her close, ignoring the pain in his ribs, feeling her shoulders shake with relief. "Let's go home, girl," he whispered. Through the courthouse windows, they could hear the Utes' victory calls rising clear and strong in the morning air. Spring brought new life to the valley. Green buds dotted the aspen trees, and wildflowers dotted the meadows near Lavater. Inside the whitewashed mission school, Sister Margaret watched as Susanna helped a young boy shape his letters. "You have a gift," Sister Margaret said later, her weathered hands folded on her desk. "We need a teaching assistant, someone who can reach the children who struggle." Susanna's eyes brightened as the nun continued, "The position is yours if you want it." Word spread quickly through the valley. That evening, Hank Miller, the sawmill owner, drove his wagon up to Luther's cabin. "Heard your girl needs lumber for a place of her own," he said, tipping his hat. "Consider it a gift. My boy Tommy, he couldn't read a lick before she helped him last Sunday." Luther wasn't alone in building. Men from Lavater and surrounding homesteads arrived with tools and willing hands. They raised a snug cabin 50 yards from Luther's, complete with a stone fireplace and deep windows to let in the morning light. Women brought curtains and quilts, transforming the raw wood into a home. On Sunday morning, Luther and Susanna walked together into the little church. She wore a new calico dress, sewn by Widow Carson. When Reverend Matthews called for the first hymn, Susanna stood in the front pew, her voice rising clear and strong. The congregation fell silent, letting her voice fill the sacred space. After the final "Amen," Reverend Matthews raised his hands. "Brothers and sisters, look upon this child. Once cast away, now she stands as a light among us. Through her, we see God's grace made manifest." People lingered after the service. Martha Jenkins brought a cherry pie, still warm. "For all those times I looked away," she whispered, hugging Susanna tight. Tom Bradley's wife carried a stack of books, readers and primaires for Susanna's future students. Luther watched from the church steps as one by one, townspeople approached Susanna. Some offered quiet apologies, others simply pressed her hand in theirs. His girl stood tall, accepting their gestures with gentle grace. The spring breeze carried the scent of pine and promise through the open church doors, and Susanna's smile shone brighter than the morning sun. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green. From her cabin porch, Susanna watched 2 bluebirds dart between the newly leafed aspens. The rough-hewn boards beneath her felt warm, and her pen scratched steadily across the paper in her lap. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The girl at the reform home needed to hear this truth, plain and clear. Susanna's neat handwriting flowed across the page. "You are not too big to be loved. You are not too much. Don't forget that." The creak of boots on wood made her smile. Luther appeared with 2 tin cups of steaming coffee, his shadow falling across her letter. He lowered himself beside her with a grunt, his knee still stiff from the winter's injury. The coffee was strong and sweet, just the way she liked it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the spring breeze ripple through the tall grass. A patch of wild iris bloomed near the creek, their purple heads nodding in the morning light. Luther cleared his throat. "I'm thinking I'll plant peach trees," he said, gesturing to the sunny slope between their cabins. "Good soil there, deep enough for roots to take hold." Susanna folded her letter carefully, tucking it into her Bible. Her eyes traced the path that led down to Lavater, where children would soon fill the mission school's rooms. "I'm thinking I'll have a school by next year," she said softly. "A proper one, with desks and books and children who need someone to believe in them." Luther's weathered hand found hers, rough palm against smooth. "You'll have everything, Susanna Pike," he said, his voice thick with pride and promise. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had carried her through winter storms and courthouse battles. The sun warmed them both, and somewhere in the fresh spring leaves, a meadowlark began its morning song. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wild sage and new grass. Susanna closed her eyes, savoring the peace of this moment, the rightness of being exactly where she belonged. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.